Thank you so much. Okay, so I'm delighted to be here. I'm so happy to have the invitation. And my talk today is really from the perspective of an experience as an autistic person. I'm not actually presenting research data, but really this is about ideas and conceptualisation and hypotheses. I should say from the very beginning, I'm not an eating disorder specialist, and so to bear in mind that I'm coming from the perspective as an autism specialist. And whenever I work with someone on the spectrum, an autistic person, I work closely in collaboration with the eating disorder team and the specialists there so that we can collaborate. And finally, if anyone would like a reference list, please do contact me. I'd be happy to do that. Not so finally, actually, what I did want to mention is I've got a flyer here, and that is for the World Congress of the International Association for the Scientific Study of Intellectual and Developmental Disabilities. And this is an international congress that's taking place on the 6th to the 9th of August 2019. There's a call for research papers and also a date for your diary in case you're interested in finding out the latest developments. Okay. So before I get started, this is a dedication, and it's for, as I phrased it, the wonderfully beautiful, dynamic brains of autistic people whom are experiencing or have experienced suffering through an eating disorder. And for all the struggles that they endure and experience daily, lest we not forget to elevate how talented and their wonderful characteristics. And let's elevate that into our consciousness and not forget that, because autistic brains make the world a better place. And in particular, thank you. Thank you. And in particular, I'd like to say a special mention to the woman who that describes, an autistic woman who has experienced an eating disorder for much of her life, who actually forced me to come to speak at this talk today. So thank you for putting my name forward. You know who you are. So just an overview, I cannot talk about theory or anything else about autism unless we talk about autism and society. That's very important to me, so I'll start with that. I want to talk about participatory autism research, and in doing so I'm going to talk about theorising from the outside in and theorising from the inside out, and I'll go into that in some detail and why that's important. That'll be a theme. And then at the end, I'm going to talk about how we integrate different perspectives and just really hypothesise about where I'm thinking at the moment in terms of theory or hypotheses. So I also want to say, as an autistic person myself, and I didn't receive a diagnosis until 32, although I think it was quite apparent to everyone around me when I announced my autism diagnosis. They all nodded and said, yes, We thought that clear, okay. I take my role as an autistic clinician as one of great responsibility, and almost view myself as some way like a bilinguist. I use clinical language, and I've been trained to use and operate within a clinical model of language, but I also am very aware of how language is important. I'll come on to that in a moment. But it's my hope, really, as an autistic psychologist, to be the bridge that kind of connects both the autistic community and the research and clinical community, and that's an important role that I really have embodied in my work. So a note on the power of language, it links to my previous point. So as an advocate for the autistic community, I feel really duty-bound to mention the power, threat and meaning that can be attributable to our use of language. And as I discuss the theories today, I tend to stick, for simplicity's sake, with the language that's been used of the theorists. But by preference, by the majority of the autistic community, I'm going to use condition first language, autistic person, as opposed to person first language, person with autism. And if you want to know more about the preferences of most of, the majority of the autistic community, one way to look at that would be the Westminster Commission on Autism report, if you want to find out more about that. So words like disorder, pathology, abnormality, atypicality, and someone said to me recently, well, what's wrong with atypical? By the definition of the word typical or typicality, there's an ideology there about desirability to be within the norm. So when we work with the autistic community, it's very important to be mindful of that, us as an organisation and myself also. So this is where my interests come in, 18th century philosophy, anyone? I very much a fan of existentialism and some of the ideology of that, and this is one of my favourite quotes, and it's really to say that please never assume that every autistic person views their autism as a disability. I personally, for one, refuse to be defined by a social construction of pathology, and many autistic people, they, and we construct autism as a value, as an asset, and that's not to discount the challenges that can come with being autistic, but it's also important not to assume. And certainly in my work, a key factor is using the social model of disability, that the world is a disabling place. So we must collectively move away from ineffective and outdated theory and conceptualisations of autism, particularly those that do not account for the lived experiences of the autistic community. And we are on very shaky ground indeed if we start from the premise that all autistic people lack theory of mind, that all autistic people have a male brain and they're systematisers, lack empathy, are disabled by their repetitive, stereotyped, restrictive behaviours, and that all autistic people have some form of deficit because of sensory sensitivities. Actually, we need to recognise that what autism looks like is much broader than that. And this is a wonderful talent of an autistic artist by the name of Beth Wilson. And here is one of the talents here, evidenced by this amazing artwork, which I use quite often. So it's important that we start to broaden our view of what autism means, not only to the autistic person, but at a societal level. So on the issue of participatory autism research, a brief mention on it is really to say that as an autistic clinician, research that excludes the autistic individual and the autistic community, that makes me anxious. That is anxiety provoking to me. We have to engage in participatory autism research, and autism scholars, for example, some of you will be familiar, Luke Bearden and Damien Milton. If you haven't read those works and you are working alongside an autistic person, please do. Particularly as a clinician, I advocate that all psychologists view their work as a prerequisite to any level of research contact or clinical contact with an autistic person. Autism must now, if it hasn't already, be viewed as culture. And today, my main point I want to make, one of the main points I want to make, is that we are better together. The neurotypical community, or non-autistic people, are much better in terms of formulating when they work collaboratively with the autistic community. And I've chosen today to divide the theories that I'm going to present on in two main categories. I'm going to talk about outside-in theorising, and for me, I define that by hypothesising and theorising based upon behaviours from an external observer point of view, trying to look into the mind of an autistic person. And secondly, I will be looking at inside-out theorising. So that's the position that an autistic person has the perspective of their inside world, and they know what it is like to be autistic. And so we have to have that perspective. It cannot be the case that we're beginning to hypothesise on what it is like to be autistic by not including autistic community in research. So, on that note, we'll talk about theorising from the outside in. And back in the 1980s, we started with this deficit in theory of mind hypothesis. The idea that an autistic person has an incapacity to read and predict the thoughts and behaviours of others, and that was considered a characteristic symptom of autism. Theory of mind enabled researchers to deduce that this caused an absence of empathy, a lack of understanding with respect to the intentionality of others. Then, in the 1990s, researchers brought forth a new theory of central coherence. This was the idea that there's a deficit in the process of dynamic integration of information with respect to context. So that idea of not being able to see the bigger picture. And this, for me, was the first outside-in theory that started to really grab my attention. In the late 1990s, Griffin and Tyrrell began to formulate a theory of kaitexia, and that refers to context blindness. This refers to difficulties with parallel processing of the executive functioning due to variances in the integration of information from the cerebral hemisphere. When I first encountered this theory, I became excited because it helped me to formulate my experiences of clinical practice. Firstly, I was frequently coming into contact with autistic girls and women that were being misdiagnosed with borderline personality disorder. And secondly, it helped me to formulate about why there's such variance, huge variance within autistic spectrum conditions. This theory attempted to unify both theory of mind and central coherence. And this is the kaitexia hypothesis. Context blindness results from right brain or left brain dominance in cognitive processing. So for me, this really helped to make sense of why there was this kind of huge variance with the stereotypical autism presentation, and then more of what I would say is a passive autism presentation that's commonly referred to as a female phenotype. So with kaitexia theory in autistic brains, information processing is not integrated, which leads to difficulties in seeing the bigger picture and difficulties in mentalising. And this is because decision-making relies on the dominant processing of either the left or the right hemisphere. So there's difficulty in seeing context because of the differences in the way the brain concentrates and divides attention. So to cope with context blindness, the autistic person must live in familiar environments to create an understanding of what is expected of them. And this increases competence and confidence in their role to such an extent that some people may not be noticed as autistic at all. So let's have a look at this parallel processing in a bit more detail. So the theory would say that evaluation of risk, novel contexts, things that are new, requires integration of multiple streams of information that is incoming simultaneously, previous learned information that has been stored from past experience is compared with new information, analysis of the costs and benefits of different alternatives takes place, which allows for the regulation and control of behaviour to be carried out. This new assimilated learning is then updated and stored away in memory to be used at a later date. The capacity to integrate and store numerous streams of information via cost-benefit analysis promotes flexibility in behaviour by optimising decision-making. Just go back a second. So really, kaitexia theory states that an autistic brain does not parallel process in this way. And the theory posits that actually REM processes supports integration of information in an autistic person. So that's rapid eye movement. So at the risk of making this into a really dull science lesson, what we'll do is we will just have a little look at some brain structures for those who might be interested. I'm not going to go into any detail. But the parts of the brain that are responsible for this functioning is the anterior cingulate cortex, which is for evaluating action, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is involved in cognitive control, and then that's linked to a system known as the medial thalamic nuclei. Now, what's really important about this is thinking about executive functioning. It's bilateral. It uses both the right and the left hemisphere of the brain. So the integration between the right and left hemisphere circuitry is less integrated in an autistic brain, resulting in context blindness. So away from the neuroscience bit, this table has been taken from a research paper that I've got up in my next slide. But for me, my head was doing lots of kind of fireworks when I read this. So on the left-hand side, we've got what's been referred to as Sinstra, left hemisphere dominance. On the right, we have dextra, right hemisphere dominance. And what I would draw your eye to are three things. Draw your eye to cognition, emotion, and behaviour. So here it's saying that left hemisphere dominant autistics have linear, rational, analytic processing. They experience too many unknowns, not enough associations making connections. And the information gathered and structured slowly is in a very logical, linear way. And there is not really as much difficulties with focus and concentration. Compare that to a right hemisphere dominant autistic person. This theory suggests that there's too much association. There is lots of abundant random associations that are so overwhelming. And this kind of relates to campaigns like #TooMuchInformation. And actually, really, there's so much information in the process that it causes huge distraction problems, real difficulty with concentration. And then linked to the emotion, we've got, with the left hemisphere dominance, we have difficulty in perceiving emotions, not having that identification, not feeling, not really getting the emotions in terms of experience in that moment. And then for right hemisphere autistic brain, the theory suggests that there's high emotional ability and almost explosivity. So again, this was really ringing bells for me in terms of particularly when I was seeing borderline personality disorder patients having this diagnosis and coming and thinking, I'm not really sure if that's fitting, there's something missing. And then in terms of behaviour, the left hemisphere dominant autistic person, the theory would suggest that there's difficulty in association, in learning. So that process of parallel processing in the brain, that inability or difficulty with actually linking past experiences and learning from them. And this has implications for me, particularly when we consider aspects of therapy like cognitive behavioural therapy, when we're expecting people to learn from experience. And the right hemisphere dominant autistic brain, the theory suggests that there is real distrust and almost a kind of sense of there's so much information to process with regards to interaction that the emotional experience is overwhelming. What I should actually point out as well, that the kaitexia theory states that although there's differences across dominance of hemisphere processing, that there are main factors, or there is a broad experience, either right or left, always experience significant anxiety. The theory also states that there's theory of mind difficulties, slow processing, difficulties in adapting to newness, and sleep disorders as well. So really the theory is saying there's a dominance in hemisphere processing, but there are a broad kind of core features that both autistic types experience. So let's have a look at how we would kind of apply this theory in terms of trying to understand the autistic experience. So right hemisphere dominance and eating disorder population, could this help us in any way to make sense of what we are experiencing? Can it help us to explain why possibly autistic spectrum conditions are underdiagnosed in an eating disorder population? So the idea, the idea of the stereotyped kind of profile of autism, we're not really seeing, and we're not able to, in our current methodologies and understanding, appropriately picking up the right hemisphere dominant autistic experience. And can it help us to explain why borderline personality disorder is fairly frequently misdiagnosed in an eating disorder population? That's my experience as a clinician, that there's a lot of borderline diagnosis that's co-occurring within that population. And this is something that's of interest to me. So I have some colleagues who, within the context of an autism diagnosis, they're referring this profile to something known as pathological demand avoidance, which some of you might be aware of. So let's have a little look at that. So I'm quite clear, I think, here about how I feel about the language terminology. So I've often considered, how many autistic girls and women have, this kind of sustained experiential avoidance. This idea of autistic transference and emotional fusion. So we're due to publish a paper shortly in Good Autism Practice, which is this idea that many of the autistic people we work with experience almost an emotional absorption of the mood states of others that are around them. So much so we've got this hyper empathy response. It's hugely overwhelming, and really, this links to the empathy imbalance hypothesis. So previously it was thought that autistic people didn't have empathy, but my personal and clinical experience would say to me the majority experience overwhelming, intense empathy. And high expressed emotion environments. So for me, what I'm really observing is that because of this tendency or this ability to absorb the mood states of others and really embody that and feel that, they're really struggling to kind of cognitively make sense of where that's coming from. Why am I experiencing this? And really, if we think about a concept known as high expressed emotion, these are environments where you can imagine there's a lot of emotionality, sometimes negative, but certainly sometimes the environments can be someone who's very caring or nurturing and asking a lot of questions about, can I get you a drink? Can I get you this? Can I get you that? So in likelihood, my kind of formulation at the moment is that high expressed emotion environments hugely increase the likelihood of this need to have experiential avoidance, because the emotionality and the empathy is just so overwhelming. And this kind of comes to my idea about demand avoidance and social and environmental trauma. So for many of the autistic people that I have worked with, they have had inpatient stays, they have had extremely distressing sensory environments to manage, they have been managing the emotional output of other patients on the ward. In actual fact, that environment from a social and an environmental perspective is traumatising. And my thoughts are that actually this idea of pathological demand avoidance is rational hugely because what they're experiencing is a form of post-traumatic stress disorder. So we've looked at the application to assessment. Let's look at the application of the kaitextia theory to formulation. So dichotomous thinking style. So within the context of eating difficulties, good versus bad food, categorising. Cognitive avoidance of suggestion to increase food or menu repertoire. So that would require more flexibility in thinking. That would require a shift between right and left hemisphere functioning, particularly when we consider left hemisphere functioning as more logical, sequential, and there's an emotional aspect to avoidance. Repetitive, ritualistic, habitual eating patterns, so fixations on visual appearance, and we learned a little about that right at the very start today about how visual appearance of food is so important. Difficulty integration and assimilation of new learned information with past experiences. So this, as I said, this has major implications for CBT, because if we're buying into the kaitextia theory, if there's lots of radical, huge free association, lots of information inbounding all the time, an individual in a social interaction situation will be very wary in terms of, did that hello mean a good thing or was that a bad thing? And there's reading into situations that can be very, very confusing. So this has major implications for therapeutic relationship. Emotional dysregulation, particularly when challenged therapeutically. And I think from the social aspect of emotional dysregulation, my advice would be to anybody working therapeutically with an autistic person, they must read Damien Milton's double empathy problem. It's absolutely essential that we understand the social perspective of the autistic person and how that interacts with a neurotypical person. Challenges building therapeutic alliance, and it really links into that idea of too much information, really trying to sort through who's friend, who's foe, and particularly with high levels of emotionality. And this is the paper where this is not actually the theorists themselves, but this is an interpretation of the theory. It's really fascinating paper. If you're not really into the neuroscience bit, skip the first part, and then you'll get some really interesting insights about the difference of approaches that could help with right versus left hemisphere dominance. What I would say is this paper, the grammar is a little bit challenging because it's actually been translated from French. So perhaps if you're reading it and thinking some of the language isn't great, just be mindful of the translation process contributing to that. So we move on to the really good stuff now. My opinion. So theorising from the inside out, okay? So the idea that the theorising about the experience of autism happens from the inside, what it feels like, tastes like, smells like, it's all theorising from the internal experience outwards. And these three individuals are very popular within the autistic community, and they should be very popular amongst clinicians and researchers also, because what they have to say is extremely important and fascinating. So these individuals are from the left, starting Dina Murray. In the middle we have Wen Lawson, and at the far right we have Mike Lesser. And I was at Scottish Autism Conference, 50th anniversary conference last week, and Dina had used this picture of Mike and assured me that he wasn't from like the 18th century. He just liked to dress this way, a very charismatic photograph. The theory of monotropism was published in the Journal of Autism in 2005. And what I would like to know is that when I was at the Park Fringe Festival, which was autistic-led, and every autistic person in that room, it screams really how much this theory captures their experience. What I would like to know is why there's no empirical research being conducted on this theory. We need to start doing that because it makes sense to, I would say, every autistic person that I come into contact with and share this theory. They relate to it so much. So let's have a look at that. The theory of monotropism is an ecological theory. So we consider attention as a scarce resource. When you have a scarce resource, it's limited in its availability, and so cognitive processes are forced to compete. And cognitive operations are based on a single focus of attention. Flow states, that's a state when engaged in a repetitive stereotyped activity, if we're using clinical language, or if we're using some other stereotyped language, special interests, or just interests, we experience a real hyper-focus, and that was something Kathy had explained earlier today. And this idea of something called autistic inertia, and that is the differences in initiation and perseveration of an activity. So interests that are active at any given time tend to consume most available energy. And it causes difficulty with tasks that demand a broad span of attention, which causes difficulty with tasks that demand that wider attention span. So in a flow state, really, you know that phrase, being in the zone? Being in that zone when attentional resources are fully available, when a task is too boring, then being in a state of autistic flow is gone. But also when a task is too frustrating and too cognitively demanding, flow state is gone. And repetition, single focus interests and behaviours, it's not about attention, it's not about theory of mind. This theory would state it's actually more about the way attention is processed. And monotropism theory can therefore account for things like alexithymia and interoception, because diversion of attentional focus is really influencing what an individual experiences at any one time. So let's go into flow state a little bit. This is some of my subjective language here, by the way. Flow state, intrinsically rewarding. Myself and the autistic people that I work with, both therapeutically and through research, we get this kind of idea of it feeling fantastic, really superb. You've got this optimal functioning state. When I'm in a flow state, it's absolutely fantastic because I get so much work done, but I'm able to make really nice connections, whereas sometimes in other ways I've got far too much free-flowing thought going on. Thinking becomes easier and clearer. It's less effortful processing. It seems to just happen so easily. Fatigue is decreased. I actually frequently hear people say they become highly energised by engaging in their interests that initiates this flow state. And extrinsically rewarding, there's increased productivity, which is great when you've got a lot of backlog of work to do. It's time efficient. Huge, immense capacity for learning, making huge connections with things. And you also become expert on topics, which is quite handy as well, extrinsically rewarding. And the observer perspective is often positive. In some cases, it can be that the person is really, the observer, for example, the carer, family member will say they're content because they're engaged in their interests, and it's really a kind of form of self-soothing, some might say. And so I now want to turn to Wen Lawson's follow-up work. And Wen Lawson was really interested in how to engage autistic children through education. So this slide is taken from Wen's actually PhD work, and if you would like a copy of that, let me know, I can get that to you. So essentially, the top and the bottom, so at the top we have gamma brainwave in an autistic brain at the bottom, and we have gamma in a non-autistic developing brain. And gamma brain waves, if we just keep this simple, you know, they carry information. Gamma brain waves are involved in cognitive processing. So memory, concentration, planning, and so on. All of those things that we tend to lump together and call executive functioning. Okay. So in an autistic brain, there is increased or more excitation of gamma waves. So broadly speaking, there's higher movement within an autistic brain, but also they're desynchronized. So they're kind of dispersed, and there's high gamma waves. They're very active, but they're desynchronized. They're not uniform together. So really, the top slide shows that the gamma waves are desynchronized, but this is the really interesting part. When an autistic person engages in their interest or hobby, this induces flow state, and the gamma brain waves become synchronized together. So when synchronized, autistic people can engage in optimal learning states. They engage in a flow state. And Wen was particularly interested in this because he wanted to support autistic people to engage in things that were meaningful and fun and held their values at heart, but also supported them through an educational process. So when we enable and support an autistic person to engage in their interest, that is often described as repetitive stereotyped behaviours, we enable them to get into a flow state that promotes learning and synchronises the gamma waves so that they can really engage in that aspect of cognitive functioning. Let's have a look at this in terms of how we apply this to eating difficulties. So in monotropism, what is suggested is that restricted food intake is a stereotyped, repetitive, restricted behaviour that induces flow state. So what that would mean is that when that person's in that flow state, we've got that gamma synchronicity, everything coming together, cognitions are clearer, associations are clearer. When we ask someone to increase the diet that they're eating, so instead of eating one or two things, we ask them to eat a plate full of food and it's all touching, attention is distributed over all of those different aspects of what's on the plate. And that results in difficulty in processing, and it causes distress. So this is a cognitive way of looking at what's going on. So is there any utility of us integrating both kaitexia theory and monotropism theory? And is there going to be any benefit of putting those together to help us explain eating difficulties within autism? So this is what I would propose if we were to kind of integrate them together. Right hemisphere dominance leads us to too much information and high anxiety. There's lots of radical free associations happening as per the kaitexia theory would suggest, and that leads to extreme distress and anxiety. One example that I often use is if you're familiar with Harry Potter. Haven't put it on here for copyright reasons, but Harry Potter. I'm not sure which one it is, but it's the scene where Harry Potter has to get a key, and there's lots of floating keys around with wings, and he has to kind of get on, and he's got to chase around all these keys, and he's got to get this particular one because it's the key that opens the door. That's my description of what it's like when I'm trying to access one of my thoughts very often. So, motivated to avoid negative intrinsic experience of right hemisphere dominance, because when all those keys are floating around in my head and I'm trying to catch one of them, I've got what I've referred to as hypo-attentional control. I've got no control over my attention at all. I'm just grabbing out there, trying to get a hold of my cognitions to put them all together and thinking about that gamma desynchronicity. They're not synchronized, the gamma waves at that point. Motivated by reward to induce optimal cognitive functioning. So if we think about left hemisphere functioning being rational, sequential, problem-solving modes, is it the case, perhaps, I'm wondering if when left hemisphere is activated, there's that flow state, there's that hyper-attentional control. Engagement in behavioural repertoire via restricted, repetitive, stereotyped action or special interests results in gamma synchronicity and allows left hemisphere activation to initiate, getting into that flow state. Left hemisphere activation, is that really what's happening? Is we've got left hemisphere activation equals optimal cognitive functioning and reduced anxiety, because remembering with the cachexia theory, on the right hemisphere dominant autistics, there was high emotional experience, and that emotional experience was really quite overwhelming. So my thinking about formulating theory, what is the function in eating disorders? A coping strategy to improve attentional focus and reduce anxiety. When that wide range of attention is narrowed right down to very few things to eat visually, that reduces attentional focus. And by reducing attentional focus, we have reduction in arousal anxiety, for example. The benefit of reducing that attentional focus and perhaps switching to a more sequential, problem-solving, dichotomous way of thinking of the left hemisphere, the benefit is experience of emotional and psychological improvement. But the unintended consequence is experience of reduced physiological health and risk to life when we're considering anorexia nervosa. So there should always come a warning with hypothesizing in theories, and so this is it. And again, this is linking to my love of kind of things philosophical. So in order to support autistic people with the difficulties of eating disorders, we must transcend our current ways of thinking, formulating and conceptualizing. Otherwise, we ourselves are subject to becoming stuck in a pattern of behaviour which is not healthy, nor valued or effective in reducing the distress or suffering of those we seek to help. Many years ago, when I was an assistant psychologist, I first encountered the term transdisciplinary working many years ago, and recently at the Scottish Autism 50th Anniversary Conference, this term cropped up again. You know, we need to engage in trans-professionalism and this idea of transdisciplinary working. So in interdisciplinary working, you're working between professions. And trans really means in terms of working beyond the boundaries of your profession or experience, so integration. And at the Scottish Autism Conference, that was in the context of professionalism. So I am actually making the call for transcultural practice, the idea that we break down the boundaries between researchers and clinicians with the autistic community. We really cannot engage in trying to formulate and understand how we can help one another if we're operating in silos and we're not becoming synchronised ourselves. Thank you so much for listening. And I know that was some complex material there, so if you want to discuss this, I'll be around the rest of the day. I think we've also got the panel at the end of the day, but if any queries or questions you can't get to me today, please email me. I'd be happy to discuss anything with you. Thank you so much.